Order, order. Welcome to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 10th of March 2026. We're here today to talk to various experts and the Office for Budget Responsibility about the spring statement that the Chancellor made a week ago. And I'm delighted to welcome for our first panel the two members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, Professor David Miles and Tom Josephs. Normally there are three members of the Budget Responsibility Committee, but for many people will realise, of course, there is currently not a chair. The recruitment is underway for that position. And of course, this is the first time you've done this without a chair in post. And was there any danger without having that third person in the room that you didn't have the right checks and balances in place? How did you make sure that you made the right judgments in putting together the forecast last week?
Thank you. Well, I should say at the start that obviously it's a big regret for everyone at the OBR that Richard left. He had huge expertise in the public finances and economy and led the OBR with great independence of mind and integrity. Formerly, David and I have jointly led the OBR in his absence, which is facilitated by the legislation. And we've sort of taken decisions and judgments jointly, but as before, David mainly leading on the macro side and myself on the fiscal forecast. Obviously others should sort of judge performance, but I don't think that has constrained the delivery of this economic and fiscal outlook. It has obviously helped that this event was one that did not have a large amount of policy measures to assess, which is normally the case and is an area which takes up a lot of the BRC's time at policy events. I guess we were a third down on the BRC, but the OBR very much operates as a team. We have 50 excellent staff, so we were only 1/50th down kind of overall. But clearly the sort of leadership gap would become more of an issue over time and at a larger policy event, I think.
Okay, and obviously this was a forecast. You didn't do the scoring against the rules, but the Chancellor did choose to highlight the headroom that had been created. Were you surprised by that, given that that it was not a fiscal event, it was a spring statement?
I guess I don't think I had particular expectations around what she would highlight in the speech, and obviously that's a matter for her. I mean, we, in the Economic and Fiscal Outlook, in line with the new legislation, basically, did not do an assessment of the fiscal rules, a formal assessment. We did publish, as usual, a fully transparent fiscal forecast, which had all the relevant numbers in it. And what we tried to do is, use the space to do a sort of broader assessment of the wider fiscal context and fiscal position in the UK. So we did more to assess the kind of recent history of borrowing and debt in the UK, international comparisons of the UK compared to other countries, looked more at a kind of wider range of indicators of fiscal sustainability and more emphasis, I guess, on risks and uncertainties. And I guess that was aimed to provide a bit of a bigger picture on the fiscal position, stepping back from the more narrow assessment of the fiscal rules. And as we set out in the report, it's certainly the case that the UK fiscal position is a challenging one. Debt is at high levels. Borrowing has been stuck at around 5% of GDP for the past 4 years. It's come down a bit this year, but it's been at that elevated level since after COVID. Our borrowing costs are amongst the highest of advanced economies, and there's a lot of risks and pressures out there, not least obviously shown by what's happening in the Middle East at the moment.
Before we go on to the detail of the impact of what's going on in the Middle East, just for the record, it'd be helpful to know when you submitted the EFO, the Economic and Financial Outlook, Fiscal Outlook, to the Treasury, because of course, for the record again, the Treasury published on your behalf this time in order to make sure that there was a security around it.
Yeah.
When did you get your final documents to the Treasury?
We finalised the document on the weekend before the Tuesday, and we always have an arrangement where we provide the Treasury with 48 hours early access, and we publish information on that and who gets it in the Treasury. So we followed the normal practice in that. The actual version that was published by the Treasury on their website for us, which, as you know, is a recommendation of the National Cybersecurity Centre, they got that version literally minutes before it was published on their website.
Okay, so just to be clear, the the attacks by the US on Iran had happened after you submitted your final document?
It happened well after we closed the forecast, because we closed the forecast several weeks before that. And then the attacks happened on the Saturday as we were finalising the document, and then subsequently
not time to take it into account and do any modelling on it?
Only on a very limited way to essentially acknowledge the fact that it had created a big risk to the forecast. Yeah.
Okay, so you had got as far as that, but not any further. Just to be clear, because I think there's lots of jokes about how quickly forecasts get out of date, but obviously it was a very big event prior to the spring statement. Thank you very much indeed, Luke Murphy MP.
Thank you, Chair. So on the Iran war, what impact do you think it will have on the economy and the UK's fiscal position?
It's a very fast-moving situation, and prices in the oil and gas market, and that's the main channel through which it's going to hit the UK. Certainly in the short term, have moved around a great deal, and actually fell quite a lot during the course of yesterday, and opened up lower than they this morning than they had been right at the beginning of the week. Right now, I say right now, mid-morning today. Oil prices for immediate delivery, so-called spot prices, relative to where they were on the Friday before the military action, were up a little bit above 20%, about 23% or so. And relative to the picture we'd taken of where the markets were, they were up a bit more than that. Gas prices mid-morning today were up about 50-55% on where they were just before the American bombing and Israeli bombing began. If the world stayed like that, which is very unlikely, but if it did, and if not just the current prices, but if you then take the futures prices, which in some sense are a prediction of where those prices might go and play out over the next year or so, if you take that, although the increase has been very substantial, the knock-on effect on the level of consumer prices in the UK remains, relatively limited. If there's no change in the picture on the prices from now on forward, we estimate that something like 1% higher level of consumer prices in the UK by the end of the year. So we had thought, without taking all this into account, that by the end of this year, the inflation rate in the UK might be pretty close to 2%. Right now, if prices don't change from where they are, both the spot prices and the market expectations of futures prices, which are particularly important for the Ofgem price cap, by the end of this year, we think the level of price is about 1% higher, so the inflation rate would end the year not near 2, but near 3, something like that order of magnitude. Material, significant, as yet not on the same scale as we experienced after Russian invasion of Ukraine. Enough to be noticeable and completely unwelcome, because there's no upside of all this. We're significant importers of both oil and gas, and there's nothing but negative effects from those prices being higher. But that's kind of orders of magnitude as it looks right now. I'd have given you a different answer probably yesterday morning, and by the end of this week it could look different again. It's not clear which way we go from here.
Mr. Murphy.
How long would that position have to be sustained? Say the prices stayed as they are at the moment, for what period?
Before it started...
before that implication of a higher 1% in inflation by the end of the year.
Well, some of it comes through pretty quickly. So petrol prices have probably moved already, filling up the car. It doesn't affect household energy bills until we get a new price cap from Ofgem. That doesn't kick in until beginning of July. So there'll be nothing much happens to household energy bills from now until the beginning of July. That then would roll through, and they would go up somewhat, and that's one of the big contributors to prices being higher by the end of the year by, say, 1% or so.
If the quite just for the sake of argument came to end at the end of today, prices began to fall back, would we still see a longer tail of kind of impact on inflation, or do you think that was shorter? I'm trying to get a sense of the degree of time that this would have to go on for it to have that kind of.
I think if let's say 4 or 5 weeks from now, prices were about more or less where they were before, I think you'd see very limited effects on consumer price inflation. It would be a little bit higher in the short term because petrol prices would have gone up, but then they'll come down pretty quickly. By the time you got to the Ofgem price adjustment thing, it would have had rather a minimal effect. It would have some effect because they look at a sort of moving average of where prices have been, and there'll be a blip up. March would look like high, and then it would come back down. But I think, bigger picture, by the end of the year, it wouldn't have done an awful lot to the price levels, the measured inflation rate, if within the next 3 or 4 weeks things get back to where they were the Friday before.
If the crisis was to be sustained for an elevated period, for a prolonged period, how concerned would you be about the affordability of the government being able to repeat a kind of energy bills scheme that we saw during the Ukraine crisis?
Yeah. Well, briefly, and then maybe you could focus more on the fiscal implications or add to what I'm going to say. I think the cost of the support package back in 2022 was very substantial, something like £50 billion. It came in various bits and pieces, but the main thing was support with household energy prices. But that was, at the moment anyway, a very much bigger increase in prices, particularly in gas prices, than we've seen at the moment. I mean, gas prices from a couple of months before the Russian invasion to a couple of months after it were up something like 500% increase in gas prices. Well, we've seen, as of this morning, something like 50% increase in gas prices. So if you wanted to think of a shock large enough that could bring forth a support package on the scale back then, you'd have to see much bigger increases in gas and oil prices. I hope that doesn't happen. But that package costs about £50 billion from beginning to end. I mean, £50 billion is a big number in a context where back in November, when we took a sort of formal pass-fail almost judgment on the fiscal targets, there was about £23 billion of so-called headroom on the central forecast. So 50 in a context where you've got, in a sense, 23 or so, is one indication of how difficult it would be to have a support package on that scale. But the price changes so far are nowhere near what they were back then.
Just a couple of things to add, maybe. I mean, on the policy package, as David said, the policy package back in 2022 was obviously on a much bigger scale in terms of the energy price shock at that point. I mean, David mentioned the kind of margin against the fiscal rules. I guess it's worth highlighting that those are obviously medium-term targets, and the reason you kind of have medium-term targets is because it does allow flexibility in the short term to adjust policy in the face of shocks if government thinks that's the right thing to do on a temporary basis, and not necessarily affect your kind of medium-term fiscal forecast. But it is also the case, as I mentioned at the start, that the wider fiscal position in the UK is clearly a challenging one, and debt is at an elevated level, and markets are clearly more sensitive to movements and changes in fiscal policy than has been the case in the past. We've had borrowing at relatively elevated levels since COVID, despite the fact that successive governments have had plans to get borrowing down to a kind of more sustainable level. And one reason why they haven't been able to get it down to a more sustainable level is both because we keep getting hit by shocks, unfortunately, but also because governments introduce short-term policy loosening while still trying to stick to a kind of medium-term consolidation.
I mean, I guess on that point of the regularity of shocks, so I think there's some research that shows that half of the recessions we've experienced since the 1970s have been a result of energy price shocks. We're particularly exposed in the UK. Arguably, they're becoming more regular. Is there an argument for the OBR, given the quite significant impact these shocks have on the public finances, on inflation, for the OBR to be more consistently forecasting or modelling potential shocks to the economy, what impacts they could have on the public finances, and lastly, the sustainability or otherwise of government policies to respond to those shocks?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is something we very much do try and do. So, I mean, it's obviously very difficult to predict when a kind of shock will happen and put it in your central forecast. But by the nature of shocks, that you can't really predict them. So therefore, we in our report have a huge amount of analysis on the potential upside and downside risks to the forecast. And certainly in the past, we've done quite a lot of analysis on the potential impact of energy price shocks on the fiscal position. We did one most recently in March 2024 when there was a bit of an escalation of the conflict in the Middle East at that point, and looked at the potential implications of that for the fiscal position. And we also try and do a lot of that sort of analysis in our longer-term fiscal risks and sustainability report, not just on energy price shocks, but on other areas of potential risk to the public finances. So I think for us, that seems the appropriate way to do it is through that kind of risk and sustainability analysis. It's sort of very difficult to try and predict when a shock will happen in your central forecast.
Thank you very much, Mr Murphy. Jim Dixon, MP.
Thanks very much, Dame Meg. Just about the public finances and net borrowing going forward and what the current state of play is. I think you said when you last came before us that net borrowing was stuck at about 5% of GDP for the past few years, and we needed somehow to break free of that. Clearly the numbers that are in the spring statement reinforce that obviously 5.2% in the current year, then 4.3%, then coming down 3.6%, 2.9% as we go forward. Do you think that represents a turnaround in borrowing that can be sustained, and what will be the risks to be able to sustain that? Clearly what we've just been talking about around shocks is one factor, but perhaps factoring that out, how do you see the trajectory going forward, and are there risks to it?
So over the past 4 years, borrowing has been persistently at around 5% of GDP. We are expecting in the current forecast that this year, 25-26, ending at the end of March, it will come down to around 4.3% of GDP. So it's starting to decline, and as you say, a further decline gradually over the medium term down to around 1.6% of GDP. And that is getting down to that kind of level is a level which would mean that debt is broadly stable, slightly falling. It's a central forecast, so there are many risks around that, but they are both to the upside and downside. Clearly what's happened in the Middle East is a sort of short-term downside risk, but there are many others that we highlight in the report. So one of the biggest ones that we've obviously talked a lot about at this committee is the outlook for productivity growth in the UK, where we made an adjustment in the budget. If productivity growth were sort of to remain at the very low levels we've seen over the past decades, we estimate that would raise borrowing by about 40 billion a year. On the other hand, if it were to return to sort of towards the levels we saw before the financial crisis, then that's a big upside, around 50 billion a year. Things like interest rates, equity prices, again, both downside and upside risks around that forecast. We also talk in the report around some of the more kind of some of the risks that originate more on the fiscal side. So the reason borrowing is falling in the way that you described is mainly driven by a rising tax to GDP ratio, which in our forecast rises to around 38% of GDP, which would be a historic high in the UK. I mean, it's not that far off kind of advanced economy average, but high historically for the UK. And we highlight some risks around whether or not that will be achieved. It's driven largely by increases in personal tax, and a lot of that due to the personal tax threshold freezes. And whether or not that yield is generated very much depends on the sort of outlook for earnings in the economy. Quite a lot of the increase also comes from increases in capital taxes, and again, that's quite sensitive to assumptions on outlook for asset prices.
Thank you, Mr. Josephs.
You wouldn't say there's been I think it's been said that there's been an underappreciation of the extent to which receipts are likely to come in on the upside. Do you have a sort of forecast for whether you're getting it right in terms of the likely trajectory of receipts going forward, and whether that's going to make a difference to whether the sorts of numbers that we talked about going forward are going to be hit or not?
Well, we were assuming in the autumn budget that we would have quite a big increase in receipts in the final quarter of this year around the self-assessment deadline. And there was a lot of uncertainty around that judgment, but receipts did actually come in pretty close to forecast. In fact, they're a bit stronger than forecast. So sort of in the short term, the receipts forecast has been on track. I'd say over the medium term, it is much more uncertain. It is the central forecast, though, so we sort of see, as I say, we see both upside and downside risks around it.
Great. And I just wanted to ask you a question about, on the spending side with the SEND budget.
Yes.
Obviously, the government's made a policy decision to increase departmental spending on SEND by about $4 billion a year from 28-29 onwards. Does that decision, since the last budget, ease the pressure on the SEND forecast? And do you think the policy decisions that the government's made around SEND will affect the Chancellor's headroom going forward?
So at the budget, we estimated that the pressure from SEND on departmental budgets in 28-29 was about £6 billion. And as you say, the government's announced around £4 billion additional funding from that year on. And it's also allocated some additional funding from within the Department for Education's budget that was previously unallocated. So, I mean, obviously that goes quite a way to addressing that pressure that we previously identified. I think there's definitely still kind of risks and pressures related to SEND. Government's announced a very big package of reform, and the impact of that on SEND spending is still uncertain.
Is that something you'd be modelling going forward in order to understand whether government's made sufficient provision for SEND, particularly, for instance, on the reforms? There may be incentives for spend ahead of the reforms, as, for instance, parents try and get their children onto EHCPs, which might be more expensive, and bring spending forward. That
is possible. That is a risk we've flagged in the report. Well, we will certainly be monitoring pretty closely that area of spending, because it has been one that has grown very rapidly over the recent past, generated a lot of financial pressure both for local authorities and for central government. So it will, very important that we kind of keep track of that as the reforms are implemented.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dixon, and briefly from Mr. Chris Coughlin, MP. Thank
you, Chair. Mr. Joseph, you rightly highlight the fiscal position and borrowing concerns. If the government's portion of borrowing related to defence spending was guaranteed through common issuance with allies, would you expect that would improve the fiscal position or have a positive impact, just given the common guarantee on the interest rate?
And I think that would very much depend on the nature of any agreement that was made. So it's quite hard for us to kind of be able to model that in the absence of an agreement. We have some analysis in the report on the pressures from defence spending and the government's commitment to get to 3.5% of GDP in 2035, which is obviously a very significant commitment, would cost about £40 billion in addition in today's money. And if the government wanted to increase spending in this spending review period to get to that target on a kind of linear path, then it would add about £6 billion to spend.
You couldn't look at other examples where sovereigns have guaranteed different forms of debt. I'm just thinking, for example, Greece and Germany during the Eurozone crisis, for example. The impact on the yields paid by that sovereign.
I mean, again, I think it would depend on the structure of the deal. I mean, if the UK government was still essentially underwriting any borrowing that was involved, the markets would still take that into account, when assessing UK government borrowing costs.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Coughlin.
Yes, could I ask a question about the presumptions of spending, I think the government say they want a real terms increase of 0.3% in 29-30. And if you assume that they spend on health at the average level, if they spend on send as per the proposals and they make their 3% on defence by 29-30, I think it's been calculated that means that there'll be a 2.5% real terms cut in all other non-protected departments, a gap of about 13 billion. Am I correct in that understanding?
So the analysis we have in the report looks at, those 2 years of post-spending review spending plans where the government's just set an overall assumption for total spending rather than departmental plans. And we have analysis which looks at what the implications of that would be for unprotected departments on the basis of commitments on the NHS, defence, ODA, SEND and mainstream schools. And our calculation is that would mean that for unprotected would be facing real terms cuts of 4.4%.
4.4%.
And spending would have to be 13 billion higher, which I think is the number you mentioned, in order to have unprotected spending not falling in real terms.
I mean, that is, in any terms, quite a challenging situation for any government in terms of the presentational reality of over 4% cut in those unprotected departments. It leads one to sort of draw the conclusion that all of these numbers are sort of loaded to get through the immediate term but aren't very realistic. What could happen what would be the most likely scenarios, Mr. Joseph, that would change that outcome? And do you see that as realistic given your experience in this role?
I mean, going back to my previous answer, in order to achieve the fall in borrowing that the government has set out and get debt to a level that is, get debt on a kind of broadly stable path in the medium term, does require spending to be broadly stable as a share of GDP over the forecast period and tax rising. So that's kind of what you need to do to get the public finances onto a kind of sustainable path. And obviously, that will require the government to make choices when it comes to spending reviews around either some pretty tough prioritisation or finding ways to drive greater efficiency in public sector spending.
I think the answer that the Chief Secretary tried to give me this morning was around the value of efficiencies. Have we seen efficiencies of that scale to deal with that degree of deficit, 4.4%?
Oh, I mean, we certainly have seen times in the past when governments have been able to reduce public spending through a combination, I'd say, of prioritisation and efficiency savings. But I mean, it's certainly challenging.
We move on to look at growth. Between your forecast in late November and last week, for this year, I believe it went from 1.4% to 1.1%. Could you explain to the committee what was the main drivers of that, please?
Professor Miles.
I think partly is a response to the data we've actually seen over the last 3 or 4 months since the November budget, which has been disappointing in terms of economic activity, and GDP has not been growing as firmly as we thought might happen back at the time of the budget. It's also the case that the labour market looks like it's cooled a lot more quickly, and unemployment's gone up more than we'd thought. And the sort of forward-looking indicators of business confidence, investment intentions remain pretty weak. The view we've taken is that this weakness then rolls out through much of this year. We've taken a view that it's more likely than not a reflection of a build-up of spare capacity in the UK than it is a permanent erosion of productive potential of the UK. In a sense, that's the optimistic end of a spectrum of interpretations. I mean, the more pessimistic interpretation is, even though we had reduced our assessment of productivity growth back in November, we didn't do it enough, and we're seeing the fruits of ongoing, even weaker productivity growth. I think that's not a central forecast, and I think ours is a bit more plausible. What it means is, though, as you rightly point out, that growth through this year turns out to be, materially lower than we thought just a few months back. If we're right that what that reflects is a build-up of spare capacity, it does at least allow the scope for some more catch-up a bit later. And in a sense, you get it back a bit further down the road.
But it's 1% next year and a 0.1% following year. That's the.
What you mean getting rid of the spare capacity that's built? Yes.
Impact on growth. It's very marginal in 27 and 28, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So you get marginally higher growth the years after this year, so that you end up at the end of the forecast horizon with marginally higher growth for the back end, which offsets the bigger weakness in the growth in the very short term. So that's roughly how the forecast goes. That depends on whether we've now got a central estimate of productivity growth. I think it is, but then I wouldn't I? Because I wouldn't put my name to the report if I didn't think that. But there's plenty of risks either side.
I'm going to pass over to my colleague in a moment, but can I just sort of challenge you in fairness? There are significant measures out there that are suggesting that there is greater positivity in some sectors of the economy. And there's the PMI surveys in manufacturing and services are at significant highs in January. Does that not suggest that you're being pessimistic and that in fact we're on the cusp of a productivity turnaround and confidence levels are in a different place?
Yeah. It's possible, and I'd like to be proved wrong and hope that happens. If you look at hiring, though, in the labour market, the picture's a bit bleaker than that, and new hiring has dropped off really quite sharply. The unemployment rate has moved up, and firms seem reluctant at the minute to take on new workers, and that's having impacts in the labour market, particularly on people who are entering the labour market for the first time. But you're right. I mean, it could be that now we have a central forecast anyway of productivity that is too pessimistic. I think I may have mentioned before that if you look at the last two winners, or in recent years, of the Nobel Prize in Economics, who spent a lot of time thinking about AI and productivity, one of them, who won the Nobel Prize 2 or 3 years ago, says that AI will have virtually have a negligible effect on productivity. The person who won it last year, a man called Philip Aghion, thinks that it will be utterly transformational. So take your pick.
Economists' three opinions.
I mean, my last question before I pass over to Mr. Murphy, if I may, is on this AI business. There is quite a wide discrepancy of predictions, as you've just said.
Yeah.
But also across different economies between the US and the UK. Would you like to say something about how relatively well the UK is placed with respect to AI?
I mean, you're right. It looks a different story in the US and in the UK if you look at the data over the last couple of years, where it does seem to have had a non-trivial positive effect on productivity in the US. It's very hard to see it in the UK, I think, yet. On the other hand, the UK, it could be we're just lagging behind the US, and we've got a relatively large number of people in the UK who do research on AI. We have strong work undertaken in universities, for example. We've got some of the best computer scientists in the world. We've got a very big service sector in the UK, and one of the things about AI that the optimists at least point to is that it has the potential to boost productivity in areas that normally we think don't have strong productivity, which is in services. So that's the latest Nobel Prize winner's argument, Philip Aghion. The one from a few years ago, Darren Acemoglu. Both of those people are very familiar with the UK because they both studied at the LSE and worked at the LSE, half a mile down the road. and some of their work does rely on evidence from the UK. So they just, as I say, draw completely different conclusions about how it'll play out here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luke Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I had two follow-up questions. One was just on the productivity point and the work that the Resolution Foundation has done, particularly looking at payroll data. What is your, rather than the labour force survey, what is your assessment of their analysis?
I mean, they're right that it makes a big difference, because the labour force survey and the payroll data point to a really different trajectory in the number of people employed in the UK over the last 6 months or so. And the one that shows that there are fewer people working, not surprisingly, if they're using the same GDP output data, you get a stronger picture on productivity growth over the last few months. If you take the survey which shows much lower employment growth over that period, and that's the payroll data. I think it's a bit difficult to feel certain right now which one is more reliable of those two. The labour force survey clearly has very major problems in the past. I think the responses to the surveys from the labour force survey have increased recently, so it is becoming somewhat more reliable. Whether that makes it as reliable or more reliable or a lot less reliable than looking at sort of the payroll data and tax data, I think is a bit hard to judge at the moment. But it certainly makes a difference which one you look at.
Do you worry that, having come under some criticism, debate around modelling around productivity and its impact last year, that you could be missing it on the upside? Is that
I mean, it may be we made a change just as the data show that we were right before. We just got the timing a bit wrong. I'd actually be, I mean, I genuinely would be pleased if that was true. I've got kids who are trying to enter the labour market right now. I'd love it to be the case that productivity went up a lot. So it'd be good if we were wrong.
Can I just a slightly a related question to growth? There's obviously been a lot of focus on the supply side of the economy, but there are some economists pointing out that actually the stagnation in living standards could be leading to a big issue on the demand side, and that actually if a strategy on living standards was more central to the theory of growth, it could help boost demand and supply. I wondered whether you had, and that the government should have a bigger role in stimulating that through a greater focus on, using fiscal capacity to raise people's living standards. I wondered whether the OBR takes a view on such things.
Very briefly, I think I'd say that the fiscal capacity is pretty constrained in the UK right now. I mean, we've got debt at 100% of GDP. If you go back to before the financial crisis, it was less than 40, and the Chancellor then, Gordon Brown, said, we'll never go above 40, and now we're at 100. It's been very difficult to try and bring the deficit down from, as Tom was saying, sort of round about 5% of GDP, which is a very high level. Outside wartime, the UK hasn't run fiscal deficits in many consecutive years of that level. So I think the constraints on fiscal policy are pretty severe. Would it be helpful if there was more money available to help people with standards of living and people who are struggling, people struggling to pay bills? Well, yes, of course. I think the difficulty the government's got is that given how much the government needs to borrow, at least over the next few years, to think that you've got scope to spend 20, 30, 40 billion more, which could have a really significant effect, the risk of doing that is that the view amongst the people who you have to persuade to buy the UK government bonds is, well, they're not serious about getting back to a position of fiscal sustainability.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Back to John Glenn MP.
Yes, could we turn to unemployment? You mentioned in one of your previous answers, Professor Miles, that we've seen high unemployment. I think it's for certain age segments, particularly young people, it's reached quite worrying levels. What do you think about the labour market, what's happening structurally? I mean, there's some people would posit that the increase in the national living wage, the cost of employing people, national insurance, etc., has created disincentives for hiring. But others would say there's been other changes with AI and confidence levels and so on. What's the OBR's assessment of what's happening with unemployment and where it's going to go to next?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious in a way, at the risk of stating something that's so clear it's slightly banal. But if there is a big increase in labour cost which is not matched by productivity, that will make some companies hire fewer people than they otherwise would. And there's been a bit of that. And it's partly, we have had quite a big increase in the minimum wage. Wage settlements more generally, not just people who are at the lower end of the income distribution, but just generally have been running at 5.5% for a while now. That's stronger growth than measured productivity growth. So in a sense, there has been an increase in the cost of employing people relative to the extra output companies get from employing people. And it's hard to see that as anything other than a sort of constraining factor on levels of employment. We have taken account explicitly of the movements in national insurance contributions paid by employers, and that's been in the forecast ever since that policy was introduced.
You had it as decreasing labour supply by 50,000 in
I think it was something like that. So not transformational, not a disaster, but clearly not welcome in a world in which unemployment has been going up. I mean, you're right, absolutely right, about the incidence of unemployment is not equally spread across all groups, and unemployment has become particularly high for young people, and youth unemployment is now at much higher levels than we've seen in the past. There may be a knock-on effect there from the rather substantial increases in minimum wages.
Well, that you don't get the same productivity on a younger part of the workforce, but they're obliged to be paid the same amount as everyone else.
Essentially, yes. How big a factor that is in isolation from other factors, and you mentioned AI, where I think it is difficult to work out whether companies are substituting away from workers to, in a sense, computers. And that's a technological thing that may not be much affected by minimum wages or wages running a little bit ahead of productivity. It's just that you've got a new technology that turns out to be a substitute for labour more than a complement. By substitute complement, what I mean is that there is one view, again, it's the optimistic view on AI, that actually what it does is it doesn't substitute for people, but it increases the productivity of people. So you get no hit to employment, you get higher wages because people are just more productive. That's an optimistic view what AI does. The more pessimistic view is, well, it's more a substitute than a complement to labour.
Yeah.
One interpretation of the sort of weakening labour market is that, well, the more pessimistic view, the substitute view, gets a bit of support from what's happening in the labour market. I think, frankly, it's a bit too early to tell.
Sorry, I just want to sort of try and hone in on this, because you've acknowledged that youth unemployment is disproportionate to other levels of unemployment.
It seems to have increased more than general unemployment, yeah.
But trying to understand that, what we're trying to get to, a better understanding of what's driving that. We've had a bit of a discussion about a number of factors. What would be the answer you would give, the official answer from the OBR, in terms of why there are more young people now unemployed?
Well, my own view is one significant factor there is that if companies decide that they probably need no growth in the labour force, or maybe a slightly smaller labour force than they thought before, the natural way, the first move you would make is you'd stop hiring new people, rather than making some people redundant and at the same time hiring some new people. And since the biggest effect of what you might call a freezing in hiring is going to be on people who are joining the labour force for the first time, they're the ones that by definition have to be new hires somewhere. It's maybe not so surprising that you get a disproportionate impact when the market goes through a period of suddenly hiring. Desired levels of employment don't grow very much. Companies then don't hire new people, and that's automatically, almost in the short run, disproportionate effect on the young entering the labour force. I think that's probably my favourite number one explanation of what's going on right now.
But you also touched on young people not being as productive. But were you saying that? Or because different sectors, youth may be actually, even with inexperience, could be more productive because of physical energy, health, factors like that.
Well, there is a kind of related issue about, and it's a kind of foggy picture where you could just see bits of a jigsaw at the minute. I mean, there is, I think, as we're all aware, if you look at the health of the UK population, the adult population, there are, on various measures, there are more people who are in poorer health now, and it's affecting their ability to work. And the big increase there has come amongst young people.
Okay, so it's an
mental health.
Yeah, mental health. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, mental health. Yeah.
We perhaps we'll get into more into this, Mr. Bobby Dean.
Yeah, just to probe a little bit further on the youth unemployment bit before I move on. It wasn't just the cost of the labour going up in ordinary terms, in terms of the taxes going up and the minimum wage going up.
Yeah.
There's also the threshold change, which particularly affected any business that employed a high number of people on low wages. Is that correct? So hospitality and retail being two examples of that. Because of the way the threshold changed, the business decisions might change for them in terms of how many people they want to hire. Because the cost impact.
Yes. So, I mean, one way of putting it might be if your workforce is predominantly well above the minimum wage, and they're not sort of new young people coming into the labour force who are relatively lowly paid, one of your responses to, for example, increases in taxes and national insurance and all that, is that you can try and offset it with slightly lower wage settlements, or even ask people to take small wage cuts. I mean, you obviously can't do that if your workforce is overwhelmingly at the minimum wage, because that's the minimum wage.
Yeah. And so I guess what I'm putting to you is, do you think a potential effect on youth unemployment has been because this particular change to employment national insurance hits those industries that tend to employ young people in their first jobs?
Yes, I think there is something in that. I agree with you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to immigration.
Oh, can you just Harriet Baldwin?
Sorry.
Yes, just while we're on the subject of unemployment, if I may, Chair, question for Mr. Josephs, because I remember you scored the planning reforms as being a boost to the economy. Have you scored the Employment Rights Act at all in your work?
No, so we've not yet scored that, on the basis that we talked to both business and employers' representatives, and the view very much is that the economic impact is still very dependent on the outcome of the further consultations the government is doing and the final details of secondary legislation in a number of key areas.
Don't think it's putting anyone off in terms of employing anyone at the moment, while it's uncertain?
It's certainly creating uncertainty, but we've not in our forecast incorporated any impact yet, and we'll hope to do that once that secondary legislation is finalised.
Thank you, Chair.
Professor Miles, just before we move off unemployment, we've seen the challenges in the youth unemployment sector. We've had some interesting evidence, but you were saying that in response to Mr. Glenn, that the overlap of health and young people is an issue. It's not just the older population that's got health.
I think so.
And you're talking about mental health. If, for example, extra money were being put into mental health support for young people, how would you score that? And would you then look at the productivity of that generation differently, obviously, over time? But
I think to the extent that it looked plausible that it would have an impact on the worryingly large number of people who, at the moment, are not in employment or looking for employment because of self-reported and mental health issues. And if it looked likely that you could help a lot of those people back into the labour force, then yes, I mean that could be persuasive enough that we'd say, well, yes, there'll be more people employed and people will be brought into the productive labour force, and that would have a positive impact on output.
To be clear, so young people in work, you were talking about the productivity being less. Can you just be clear about the relationship between that and mental health? Because
I want
to make sure we haven't misinterpreted.
Yes, I think on the mental health issue, I was talking more about people who were outside the labour market and were not looking for work because of mental health issues, really.
So young people being less productive is because they have less experience in many sectors rather than health.
Well, I think it's inevitable, and particularly if you look at very young people who are looking for work at 17, 18, 19 years of age. I mean, they're unlikely to be at the start of their working life as productive as someone who's 10, 15 years into the job, and that seems natural. Almost any industry, I think.
Except perhaps possibly where physical health maybe make an impact. But
yeah, maybe.
Okay. Well, I think probably too much to get into it in this moment. I'm going to pass through to Bobby Dean to pick up on immigration issues, Mr. Green.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The OBI has lowered its forecast for net inward migration between now and 2030. Firstly, I also read that there was a methodological change. So how much of that change is real versus just the way that you're counting? And then secondly, if it is true that more people are leaving the UK, what assessment have you made of that in terms of the fiscal impact?
We made the change in our forecast about levels of net immigration into the future really on the back of the Office for National Statistics changing its methodology and how it's measured, how many British people have been leaving the UK on average each year since COVID, so the last 5 years or so. And the ONS decided that a better measure now is more consistent actually with the pattern of net emigration of Brits in the many years leading up to COVID. So they lowered their estimate. Let's get the sign right. They've increased their estimate now of how many Brits were leaving the UK by substantial amounts, 80, 90,000 a year over the last several years, pretty much since COVID. The picture they're now painting is different from where it was a short while ago. What they had before was that the number of people leaving the UK had actually dropped off rather substantially. Now they think that 70, 80,000 more people had been leaving the UK net. That is British people. It now looks like pretty much a straight line for the last 10 years. We thought the natural response to that was that looks less of a puzzle actually than what the ONS had before, which made COVID look like a watershed in how many Brits were leaving. So we've adopted their newer numbers and said that imagine the future now looks more like that. That's why we've reduced by around about 60,000 a year net immigration into the UK. And it's not so much a change in our view on how many people are coming here, it's a view about how many people are leaving.
That's clear, and it makes sense why you would change your modelling accordingly. I guess the issue that I'm trying to unpick here is it's being reported that lots of people are fleeing the country all of a sudden, perhaps because of the policies of this government, and also the composition of those people are high net worth or high earning people.
Yes,
and you're saying to me actually this sounds more like a methodological change, and so I just want you to make that clear for us. Has there been a change in the number of people leaving the UK, and given the uncertainty over us knowing how many there are, do we know much about the composition of those that have left as well?
I don't think we know a whole lot about the composition, and we took a view based on really not knowing much about the composition that the people that were leaving the UK were in a sense a representative sample of the people already in the UK. Because we didn't have any strong evidence one way or another. In answer to the question, do the new ONS estimates suggest that there's been a sort of spike up in people leaving? We have a chart, it's on page 22, it's chart 2.6. It shows the new estimates, and it's a kind of flattish line since about 2012, running at 90 to 100,000 people net leaving the UK most years. It was a bit higher than that in the most recent year. Now, make of that what one will. Some people will look at that and say, well, there's been an acceleration in the number of people leaving the UK. I look at the picture and I say, well, it's a pretty flattish line for 10 years, and there is nothing particularly unusual in just over 100,000 people net leaving the UK.
So you also said that you make the assumption it's going to be a representative sample.
Yeah.
Is that because you've got data in the past that shows that is generally true if you look back far enough? Because people will wonder whether people are more likely to move overseas at retirement or work during working lives or when they have families and so on. Is that composition, broadly speaking, correct, or what's that based on?
I think there is some evidence, but I'd like to go off and check this, and it's worth my doing so, that there are somewhat more younger people leaving in the most recent couple of years than was true in the past, where it might have been disproportionately older people, and maybe a higher proportion of people who were in retirement looking to live somewhere else after they'd finished work. If it's the case that there is a bit of evidence that it's more younger people, I think the assumption that the population of people leaving the UK is rather representative of the UK population, that would be consistent with it being more younger people leaving now, and that's what we assumed, that they are, as I say, representative.
Thank you. And if we talk about people coming the other way, people entering the country, is it true that people are, broadly speaking, similarly skilled to the UK, but as an age profile generally younger? Is that correct?
They are certainly younger than the UK population. Yes, that's true, and that's one of the reasons why the participation rate in employment is a bit higher if you take people coming into the country than the population that's already here. In terms of wages and qualifications and such, I think there's a big spread amongst the people arriving in the country. I mean, some in recent years have been working in relatively low-paid sectors. A smaller proportion are very highly paid people. I think that's one of the reasons why, in trying to work out what's the fiscal impacts of potential changes in immigration into the future, it matters the type of people who are coming every bit as much as the raw number. And obviously, as we all understand, it makes a huge difference whether you're looking at people who are coming into the UK, bringing some dependents, maybe earning less than average UK wages, and staying for a long time, versus people who are arriving earning 2 or 3 times the average wage in the UK, stay here for 10 or 15 years, don't draw upon welfare payments at all, don't stay and get a state pension when they get older, don't stay in the UK for most of the rest of their lives when they become unwell on average and use the health service. It just makes an enormous difference. The type of people who come in, how long they stay, more than just the absolute number.
I think he's anticipated my final question.
Professor Miles can see into the future and his skill for the OBR. Can I thank our witnesses very much indeed? That's Professor David Miles and Tom Josephs from the Office for Budget Responsibility. We will now have a short break, moving into our next session. You're very welcome to stay for that if you wish. Order. Order. Welcome back to the Treasury Select Committee on Tuesday, the 10th of March 2026. We're looking at the spring statement prior to our session with the Chancellor of the Exchequer tomorrow. And we're delighted to welcome a panel of expert economists to discuss various aspects of the spring statement and the state of the British economy. We've got in front of me, from my left to right, Dan Haile, who's the senior economist at the Institute for Government, Helen Miller, who is the director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Hetal Mehta, who is the chief economist at St James's Place, and Dr. Amrita, who's the founder and director of Market Intelligent Energy Aspects, and specifically very knowledgeable about the energy situation that we face. So I'm going to start, if I can, with Yuan Yang MP.
Thank you, Chair. There was a lot of discussion at the last autumn budget about there being too much media speculation, too many measures in the works. We've had also a lot of media criticism after the spring statement that there was not enough news from the statement, that there was not enough new policies announced. What do you think is the optimal pace for new fiscal announcements at either the autumn budget or the spring statement? And what do you think is the optimal way of spreading those throughout the year? Is there such thing as not enough news? I'll go to Ms Miller and then to Mr Haile.
Great, thank you. So it's definitely welcome that we didn't see the level of speculation in the run-up to this fiscal event as we saw at the last one, because, as has been discussed much in the past, that speculation in and of itself is damaging because people, firms, individuals change their behaviour in anticipation of what might be to come. So I think it's welcome that we didn't have that. I'm not sure there is an optimal. I mean, we make different cases for different setups. I think my personal view is there is a case for a second forecast. I think it is good for public debate, for scrutiny, that there is information about the state of the public finances. I think it's a little bit odd that the second statement comes just 3 months after the main fiscal event. I think that's a hangover from the old days where there was a pre-budget report in the autumn and then a budget in the spring. The kind of events got switched, but the timing didn't switch. So I think you could more easily make a case for a second forecast that was maybe at the 6-month point in the middle of the year, or maybe even closer to the budget as a kind of here's a first look at the forecast, let's all debate it, then have the forecast. So I think one could adjust the timing and move it further away from the budget. But I think the fact that there was a second event that wasn't a big event, in some sense, you always want to hold out for something extraordinary could happen that means that you want a second fiscal event of some sort. That's always a possibility, obviously. We've become accustomed in recent years to lots of big fiscal events. They don't need to be all big. So I think the fact that this was one that didn't have lots of news in it, although I note there were some policy changes between the last event and this one, the fact there weren't lots of changes, in my mind, doesn't mean that event was a failure. I think we should be okay with the idea that we get information that we can use, and that then we wait for the next event.
Thank you, Ms. Yang.
And Mr Haile, anything to add?
So I completely agree with everything Helen said. I think the specific dilemma that we've seen in previous years was the government rushing forward policy changes to try and hit changes in the OBR forecast. I think we didn't see that this time. I think that was really welcome. I think it's partly because of the way the OBR forecast moved. But I think that that dynamic, not having that dynamic driving policy making in quite that way is really positive this time round. Totally agree about the timing of the two forecasts in the year. I think we've said in the past that if we can't get out of this dynamic of the government chasing its forecasts with kind of rushed policy making, then you have to look again at whether two forecasts is the right choice. But I agree with Helen that kind of they don't need to be big events, these forecasts, but there are real benefits in terms of transparency.
And Mr Haile, would you agree with the Chancellor that there should be a higher bar for there to be more fiscal announcements in the spring, i.e. that we should try to be aiming for one big set of announcements in terms of policy changes a year, in terms of stability, or do you think actually it doesn't make much of a difference how many events there are?
I think a single main fiscal event in the year where most of the policy making is done, I think that makes particular sense on tax policy changes. It's not about not making any changes outside of those fiscal events. The government has to be able to respond to events. But I think concentrating in that way is a really sensible way of being able to see kind of fiscal policy across the piece and understand which direction the government's taking and to be able to coordinate across an agenda.
And how does the number of events and forecasts we have compare to other countries? Do we have more, fewer, about the right amount, would you say? And then Ms Miller?
I think sometimes every country is a bit different and do things a bit different, and the whole process can be different. I think most countries have kind of a second set of forecasts, so that there's information. They don't all have a second fiscal event, but countries differ a little bit, and they differ in terms of the role of Parliament and when things are announced. And I think we stand out a little bit in we got into it having these big 2 fiscal events that was big fanfare around them that became all of this. We were sort of waiting for the Chancellor to pull rabbits out of hats, and that's not something that every country does.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Yang. Luke Murphy, MP.
Dr. Sen, I wanted to focusing particularly on the impact of the Iran war. Could you set out your view on what the current impact is on both oil and gas, and which one is more affected?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. Obviously, I'm sure most of you are aware the war, what that has led to is effectively a closure of the Strait of Hormuz, even though officially it is not shut. Just for kind of context, that's about 20% of the world's oil flows and gas flows. That kind of passed through it, so LNG and oil, both impacted. Asia is far more impacted. About 90% of Asian crude imports pass through the strait. And it's not just crude oil, it's a lot of oil products, so the diesel and the jet kerosene and gasoline that we consume. LPG, cooking fuel, that's a huge part of what goes through that as well. So overall, if you're looking at numbers, it's about 15 million barrels per day of crude oil, about 5 million barrels per day for products, LPG, and gas between Qatar and UAE is about 85 million tons equivalent. So it's about a fifth, call it, for pretty much all of these kind of big commodities. The UK in particular, the good news is it actually doesn't import any crude oil. That's good, but jet kerosene is a big part. 36% of jet kerosene does come through the strait because it does import a fair amount of that from the region. There's a few other products here and there, but still 10% or less, so not too worried about that. LNG is about 4% of kind of what goes through the strait. But still, I think what I would highlight is that what has happened, and this is something everybody in the industry has feared for 40 plus years, and now that it is here, my struggle here right now is that I don't think the industry quite knows how to handle it. We are currently looking at north of 6 or almost 7 million barrels per day of outright production shut-ins. If I just go back to when the Russia invaded Ukraine, and I remember, we were getting questions similarly, Russia's exports are about 4.5 million barrels per day. So what we've shut in today is going towards doubling of that, just for context. And 15 million barrels per day in terms of the crude oil that moves. Yes, there are some diversions, but we are talking about similar levels to what during the peak of COVID we needed to reduce when demand fell. Similar, it was about 20 million barrels per day. So I just wanted to give that context around how big it is in terms of the stranded elements when it comes to oil and gas and what is stranded right now. There, of course, isn't an end in sight as we see it right now. We are assuming this can continue at least this week. It could be longer than that as well. Of course, it depends on both sides. High energy prices is a pain point for the US government, for sure. And I think you can see maybe the US coming out with slightly narrower objectives now with what they actually want the end game to be. And maybe that allows the conflict to end a little bit earlier. The trouble, of course, is that even if there were to be a ceasefire, what does the new normal look like? We don't think that's going to be the old status quo, because shipping, we can go into that if there's questions, but war insurance, like no shipper just wants to go through it, right? What if there are these sporadic attacks? So bottom line is it is extremely inflationary, and we are going to see that. Obviously, for Europe, gas matters more in terms of the electricity. For the oil side of things, yes, Europe gets from the Middle East, but much more is from the region itself, right? Europe has its own production. West Africa produces a lot and gives it to Europe, US as well. So there are alternatives. It's Asia that is seeing the biggest impact. But because oil and gas markets are global, it's not that Asian. Sure, there are certain Asian prices that have gone up, but all of us are seeing the impact. The last thing I would say is which is very concerning, we are already seeing certain countries, by certain countries, I mean China, India, the two biggest exporters of products, and Thailand. Security of supply is now at the forefront of their minds. They have already come out and said, not an outright ban, but they've already told refiners, please don't export products, keep it for ourselves. This is a huge thing. China is a massive exporter of products. India is a big exporter of products, and we all in Europe, we buy diesel, jet fuel, naphtha from these countries. So again, the pass-through for the end consumer is going to come through that oil products markets.
So essentially you're saying there are medium to long-term impacts, regardless of, even if this were to end tomorrow, that we now would need to factor in, although we don't necessarily know what all those implications are. Is that fair?
I think I'd go with the latter, which is we just don't know what it looks like. I would not assume that just if it were to end tomorrow, we just go back to what we were, say, end of February. I think there will be a lot of caution. And again, I go back to security of supply will become so paramount, especially when you've got, China, India, Korea, Japan together, about 70% of their imports come from the Straits of Hormuz. So suddenly they're going to look at this and say, okay, we need alternatives. We need to look at our own security of supply very differently. And they will all take measures which just mean that you're going to have a bit more of hoarding potentially from Asia that has implications for what's going on over here. And like I said, we just don't know how long this will take to kind of go back to quote-unquote normalcy, where shippers can rest assured that there are not going to be any attacks on any of the vessels or on infrastructure. As we are sitting right now, there are attacks on energy infrastructure in GCC countries going on right now. Refineries are shutting down, etc. So yeah.
Beyond oil, do you have a view on the kind of the broader basket of products that we're going to see kind of inflationary impacts in? I think someone talking about fertilizer.
Yeah. So gas, but I think that's what I'm saying. I think gas probably has a more immediate impact, and we've already seen in some of these countries fertilizer costs. I mean, obviously gas is a huge input to it. A lot of countries in Asia, they've already said to the fertilizer companies, you can't use gas because everybody's going to prioritize consumers. And power industry, like industry generally, is getting the hit and saying they're being told do not use gas. So potentially, again, depends on what alternative sources they have to burn. Could be green energy, but could be even going back to liquids. The other thing we are kind of going through and doing the work now is the second order effects. Look at Taiwan, for instance. The chip manufacturers, gas is their biggest source of power in terms of the generation fuel, right? So suddenly, do you get those second order impacts where you start to halt factory production because of you're not getting enough gas from the Strait? So those are the things we're looking at. So it's not going to stop at the energy level. It's going to go to the next level where if industry is being hit, which it is, absolutely, I think you're going to start seeing that, not straight away, right, but in a month or two.
How do you think this crisis reflects on the UK government's current medium to long-term energy policy of moving to clean energy? Do you think that has validated that in some way? Or?
I mean, look, what I'd say is, at least the numbers we do and the way we do the analysis is we've always been big believers that all forms of energy are going to be required. Mm-hmm. I think the notion that we're going to go into peak energy demand has been proven to not be working out. Even the IEA came out and kind of changed their tune on that. When you have such levels of demand growth, I think it's going to be very hard to just focus on one form of energy, be it green or be it oil and gas. I think you will need all forms. And I think for us, it's more about let's decarbonize. If you're going to use hydrocarbons, decarbonize it. And then you can, of course, on top of that, use the green energy that's required. But using green energy as baseload at times like this is also a problem because, again, if the wind doesn't blow, for instance, you then have the other issue of then having to use gas, which is going to be much higher price level. So there needs to be a much better balance across the board.
So in our previous panel, Professor Miles from the OBR suggested that if this was prolonged, we could see inflation rise to 3% by the end of the year. Do you think it's too soon to make modelling assumptions around that? And then I'll direct that to you. And then, Ms. Mehta, if you could say a bit more about what you think this implies about the kind of public finances and inflation in the near to medium term.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably a little bit too soon because I know it feels like, I mean, everybody's, I'm sure, up 20 hours a day right now, given everything that's going on, but it has been a week, right? And a week and a bit. So I would say, look, if this continues through March, then yes, we need to talk about it, because again, it's the feedback loop through all the different supply chains that we talked about. We are going to see an impact. And I think the one thing I will mention is that gas prices and oil prices both, we were going into this era of gas, everybody was talking about this global glut, lots of projects coming online. We are already starting to hear from major producers such as Qatar, you could start to get projects delayed, because again, big companies will also be very careful in redeploying staff to the region after what has happened. So suddenly some of the kind of glut narrative shifts as well. Same with oil. We were supposed to be in this big oversupplied market. I think that narrative shift is very important, because suddenly that forward curve or the futures curve just goes up higher across the board, and then that feeds through the inflation, and that's when the interest rates do come into the picture.
Before we move to Ms. Miller, I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Sen, you mentioned that 36% of jet kerosene, that's to the UK, comes from
yes.
the Straits. So you presumably then that leads to an increase in the costs of flights, or is there any way that the airline industry can mitigate that?
Unfortunately, I think jet is probably the worst affected globally, by the way. And of course, everybody's talking about the crude oil price, but there are prices for jet that have gone above $300 per ton. Like, it is really crazy what's going on in the jet market, because so much of the jet production is in the Middle East, and they also kind of transport that over here. It is not going to be possible to meet that jet demand through other sources, because part of it is because Asia also produces a lot of jet fuel, and if they are not getting the crude oil to make that jet fuel, that's going to have an impact. So I'm expecting quite significant rises in airfares.
So you think it will go straight through to airfares, and realistically, people will be planning their holidays now for the summer. Some will have already booked them. So could potentially have an impact on airlines' business model, because they've already been prepaid at a lower rate.
Yes, some of the airlines also hedge, so I think that if they've done that, that would have helped them a little bit. But in general, we absolutely should be expecting higher airfares for at least the next couple of months.
Thank you very much indeed. Helen Miller, picking up on Mr. Murphy's question.
Sure. I think it's unambiguously bad news for living standards in the UK and for public finances. I think there's no upside to any of this. No one knows yet how bad the bad news is, because it really is going to depend on how prolonged the conflict is and how high inflation goes. I think the big effects of this are going to be through inflation, for all the reasons that were just discussed. So not just the direct effects on airfares and the price of filling your tank or heating your home, all those other knock-on effects. So transporting food will become more expensive. Basically, a big input into what we do has become more expensive. We are going to have less resource. Just picking up on the sort of public finances angle of that. Inflation will feed through in a few direct ways. So, for example, if the inflation measure ends up being higher, that will sort of lead directly into higher welfare payments that are indexed to inflation. The effect on overall public spending is a bit more complicated, because basically, obviously, the government sets out cash plans. If inflation is high, you could allow them to be eroded. Effectively, you'd have lower public spending in real terms. You could, however, see pressure to top up plans to keep them going in real terms. We could see calls on the government to step in and put together some kind of energy package to support households. That would come with a cost. You would see higher receipts. We have a tax system based on cash. A higher cash economy means bigger tax receipts, but that inflation would also mean lower growth, and that would have a dampening effect. It would also depend on how the Bank of England responded with interest rates, where you see higher interest rates would feed through into higher government borrowing. Looking through all of it, the big picture is that if it is sustained, we are poorer, and the governments are either someone's going to have to bear the burden of that, whether it's people directly, people through higher taxes to pay for higher spending, or lower public spending. I think how that washes out depends on both how bad the crisis is and how bad the increase in prices, and the choice the government makes basically as to how to distribute the pain of that.
Thank you very much indeed. So moving to John Glenn, MP.
Yes, can we...
Sorry, you and Yang, did you want to come? Did you need to...
Yes, Dr. Sen, I wanted to ask you, you last came to speak to this committee at the start of the Ukraine war, when there was also another global energy shock. Do you see that the UK economy is in a better position to weather those shocks these days than it was 4 years ago? And if not, what more do we need to do to change that?
I think in general, most countries, I would say, including the UK, have done a lot more and learned a lot from the Russia-Ukraine crisis in diversifying a lot of kind of energy. But again, the imports still are from very similar countries, right? That hasn't necessarily diversified, but we do get a lot more energy from the US now, which has been definitely a change because they've been increasing their production. The challenge, I think, unfortunately, for this time around is that we have never seen something like this. On a volumetric basis, this is the biggest disruption in the history of the energy market. So, even if the UK has done better or worse, it doesn't matter almost, is kind of what I'm trying to say, given the scale of what we're seeing. But again, I go back to what I was asked earlier. I do think a balanced grid is a better outcome, and rather than relying on one or the other. It's not just kind of going green, it needs to be a balance of everything, given the shocks tend to, this is not just an isolated industry. When you hit one, it kind of cascades through all the other bits and pieces as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Yang. John Glenn, MP.
Thank you. In the previous panel, you'll have heard that we heard the evidence from the OBR about the presumptions around where spending will be towards the end of the period. I think for the unprotected departments, a 4.4% cut. I think the IFS states that for next year's spending review, there's an assumption around day-to-day departmental budgets growing by 1% per year over 3 years. What lessons can we draw from previous seasons of how realistic that actually is? Because, and if I may, just so that I can stop and listen to more wisdom from you, Smilla, you've also, since last time we saw you, put together a traffic light proposal. This wasn't universally well received. We had Mr. Hughes say that it would give the opportunity for people to, I think he used the word target or target shop. I think you'd like the opportunity to respond to that.
Sure, thank you very much. So on the first one about public spending, I think it is worth saying that the governments really do have choices here. So spending overall is still planned to grow in real terms. There is no inherent law of the nature that says that governments couldn't stick to that, right? That would be a choice. We have, however, many times pointed out that it's going to be challenging in the context where there are just a whole laundry list of pressures on public spending that we could, send, disability, defence spending, the list could go on. And the public finances already have some pretty punchy assumptions about productivity improvements that may or may not come off. So I think in the context of there are lots of pressures on the state, that does look pretty ambitious. And again, if we saw a government trying to increase defence spending, doesn't have to, but if it did, that will clearly put pressure elsewhere. It is historically unprecedented for the UK to be trying to increase defence spending and health spending simultaneously. We haven't done that. We've done that reverse to date. So it is unusual. If we look at history, then what you see is that what governments tend to do is pencil in tighter plans and they actually go on to deliver when the time comes. It's always easier to say, I'll do that tomorrow. For now, I'm going to top things up. So I will not be in the least bit surprised if that happens. That's not saying that's not a prediction. I think I'd say it is within the government's power to follow through on their plans. It will be a choice to deviate, not a certainty. But history suggests that that would not be at all surprising. On the traffic light proposal, I think there's sort of two different bits of that. So we published a piece of work a month ago or so, basically talking about the fiscal rules and the fiscal frameworks and highlighting what we saw as problems with that. We said very clearly at that point that there is in our minds, no optimal fiscal framework. There are pros and cons of different approaches, they come with different trade-offs, and in some sense the context really matters. We have a fiscal framework that I think is under-delivering, not just because of the precise rules that have been written down, but because of the norms that have grown up around them in some sense. And therefore, into that debate, we put a set of proposals for a different system. I'm happy to debate the pros and cons of that. Separately, after the spring statement, we put out kind of a traffic light system. That's not saying this is a new set of fiscal rules. This is just saying as a way to look at the state of the public finances, whether or not you want to make those the fiscal rules or not, just a kind of a health check. And what we're trying to do there is to say, I think changes in forecasts invite all of us to focus on what changed in the forecast. What I wanted to highlight was that actually the forecast itself is still the big news here. And the changes are small relative to the underlying story, which is that debt is high, borrowing is high, the interest costs are high, the current public finances are vulnerable. And to tie back to your original question, they do look better, the traffic lights go greener at the end of the forecast if you think the government is going to deliver on its plan to get borrowing down very, very starkly. If we didn't see that, then you'd have a set of traffic lights in our version that was still, there's lots of reds and dark oranges there. So we were really trying to display to try and move the debate beyond the just, have we got any headroom, yes or no, to that broader picture of the health of the public finances and sort of remind people that actually we still are in a pretty difficult position.
Okay, if I could just have one follow-up on that. I think over the last 3 or 4 months, perhaps as a function of what happened in the run-up to the last fiscal event, and what happened with the OBR, there's been speculation, and yourself and your predecessor were very clear about the optimism bias, shall we say, in manifestos in general elections. And I think Mr. Hughes and Sir Robert Choate, in their evidence to the committee a few weeks ago, were also clear that actually we need less chopping and changing if we're going to move the dial. Do you have any reflections on that? Because one of the, I think, frustrations is that we do have, for people looking in at our economy, is that governments come in, they make interventions, there's not enough time to really assimilate their effect. Do you think your proposals would help with that? And what other things could we look to ensure that we have a more rounded and sort of authoritative view of public finances that will withstand that short-termism?
Yeah. So I do think the short-termism is a problem. I think it's worth saying, I don't think it's unreasonable that a government wants to make changes to policy, and it might be perfectly plausible that a government wants to make changes every year because they're progressively doing something better. I think the problem is when we have changes that are not the result of some well thought through policy process where we think, yes, we know this is right. It's like, oh dear, something happened, we need to change it really quickly, and the volatility is highbrow into bad policy choice. That's what concerns me, as opposed to the fact that we change policy at any given frequency. What we were arguing is that given, and it's not really a statement necessarily even about like the fiscal rules in abstract terms, that given the debate we are currently having, where it's been laser focused on this headroom number, and the debate has descended into those two numbers, it's kind of to the expense of other things. The argument is, would it be nice to break out of that equilibrium and try something that actually shone a light on the broader set of things? So I think a traffic light, again, there is no optimal here in my mind. There are just pros and cons. Our argument is that a traffic light kind of system would naturally lead you to realise that there were more things to focus on. And in some sense, it would be harder to game it because you might be able to game one, but trying to game a list of indicators would make it harder. But I think what we need, whether you use a fiscal traffic light system or something else, we need to get to a place where everybody is focused not on a given headroom number, but on the broader picture of debt is high, borrowing is high, debt interest costs are high. How are we going to get in a position so that those things are better, so that if shocks come along in future, we're better able to respond to them?
Thank you very much indeed. Could I move to Ms. Mehta on the gilt yields that we see in the UK? They're the highest in the G7. Please could you explain to us why that is?
Sure, thank you for the question. I think there are a number of factors that move gilt markets, and one thing that's really important to think about when we do international comparisons is actually just people focus a lot on, say, the 10-year gilt yield and just compare that to, say, Bund yields in Germany or treasuries in the US. We also have to think about what the risk-free rate is in all of those countries. So the ECB policy rate, for example, in Europe is significantly lower than it is here in the UK. That needs to be taken into account. There are also currency impacts that need to be taken into account. So when our investment team actually strip those factors out, the UK doesn't look particularly, in terms of gilt yields, don't look particularly high compared to other peer countries. It is true that gilt yields have risen, in absolute terms, as the pressures on borrowing, pressures on inflation, and that's something that is being priced in, and the fact that the Bank of England may struggle to cut interest rates also feeds into that. But actually, on a kind of more comparable measure, actually gilt yields look broadly in line with other countries.
So So essentially you're saying that the analysis and the commentaries are quite superficial. They don't take account of the real value, relative values across different jurisdictions.
Yes, it's a kind of crude measure. Many market commentators and economists will look at a kind of quick and easy measure for comparability, and the calculations involved to actually strip out those other aspects can be a little bit convoluted. But yeah, it's an exercise certainly worth doing if you want to have a more credible look at the of what's considered the inherent kind of issuer risk. So do we think the UK government risk as an issuer is more significant than that of another country?
Thank you. I may just move to Mr. Haile and talk about the effect of the...
Mr. Haile.
Ms. Haile, I'm so sorry. Could I ask about the dynamics of our processes in the UK and the effect that the OBR has had? I mean, it's been... there was a lot of discussion about the dynamics between the Treasury and the OBR in the run-up to the autumn budget. What do you see in the way that the OBR's dynamics have evolved with the Treasury, and are we in the best place?
Well, I think in general, since the OBR was formed, the relationship with Treasury has been pretty good. I think we benefited from the OBR having access to government data in a way that previously we haven't had to enable scrutiny of what the government's fiscal plans are. I think coming off an autumn where clearly some of those relationships were strained, I think it's the quieter process in the run-up to the spring forecast has clearly helped. And I think that as a result, we've had a much kind of smoother run-in. I don't think that, I know the committee is looking at the OBR 15 years on more widely. I don't think that means that nothing needs to, there are no opportunities to improve those relationships. But I think certainly in the 3 months since the autumn budget, what we've seen, partly because the government hasn't been bringing forward lots of new policy measures, is a much quieter run.
I recognise that. I think everyone would say that. It was a pretty difficult situation before the budget. But I just mean in terms of perhaps more fundamentally about the Treasury's forecasting function when it has to live within the OBR's almost determinations. Is there a danger that the dynamic of decision making means that the reference point is, well, what does the OBR score rather than what an elected government thinks is the right thing to do?
I think that would be a really unhelpful dynamic, and I think we've seen the risk of that, particularly on the question of whether questions about whether the OBR would score certain policy measures on the supply side as improving productivity. And I think the move to increase the level at which the OBR is willing to look at supply side scoring is probably very helpful in terms of focusing, in terms of moving away from a situation where internally within government the Treasury is looking for policy ideas that might be able to get over this line and be scored.
And only do things over 0.1%. Is that
exactly, right? To raise that threshold from where it was before and to have some other criteria kind of in addition to that qualitatively. So I think we're hopeful that will make more of a difference in terms of making sure that it's not kind of what the OBR will score that drives the government's policy agenda. There's also room within the Charter for Budget Responsibility and in general for the Treasury to disagree with OBR judgments and to set out why they think that's the case. And I don't think it's... so I think in general the OBR isn't kind of in the position of driving government policy. It's a set of government choices, and therefore the government can choose to diverge or even at the limit change how the system works, frankly, if they don't think it's delivering what they want from it.
Mr. Bobby Dean.
Yeah, thank you. We were talking about unemployment in the previous session, and I think there are still some question marks over how cyclical we think maybe this problem is. So typically we would see maybe a spike in taxation or living wage or something that will come out in the wash over time, but it feels like it might be stickier this time, not just because of the effects of AI, but also because of the cumulative impact of all of these changes and how it's particularly affected young people in particular. Ms. Mehta, I don't know if you want to comment on that, whether or not you think we could be seeing a structural change to the labour market because of the series of changes that we've seen by this government.
I do think that on balance there is likely to be a structural element to the unemployment. So I think the upward revisions in the near term from the OBR, broadly I'd agree with. The unemployment rate is already close to those levels anyway, at 5.2, near the OBR's peak. The risk for me is that the decline in unemployment is much slower. Part of that is the structural weakness of productivity growth. I know obviously the OBR did take down their assumptions last time. I still think they are, albeit more realistic in my personal opinion, they are still at the more optimistic end. We don't do point forecast, but I'd put my estimation closer to the downside scenario that the OBR had. So that's the structural element. See, there have been a number of policy changes, whether it's regarding the national living wage or the taxation element that was discussed earlier as well. It's very difficult to disentangle the cause from the correlation, but there's definitely been an incidence where those sectors exposed and the demographics of younger people being exposed to the tax changes, or the sectors that employ lower income employees have seen the bigger changes in terms of payroll employment. And so if that policy is to persist, then that may be a kind of structural headwind to unemployment as well. And then if I can just add on artificial intelligence as well, so far the evidence is pretty mixed on the rate of adoption across different countries, and the UK probably sits somewhere middle of the road in terms of AI adoption. The US probably further ahead in that as well. But the sectors and the age demographic that is likely to be first hit by that may be, again, some younger, less experienced people where AI could be a bit more of a substitute than a complement.
Thank you. And Ms Miller, at the time when the employment national insurance contribution changes were announced, the RBR obviously baked into their forecast some effect on the labour market. It sounds like we might already be beyond that point, and it also might persist for longer. So what impact will that likely have on the public finances and the expected tax revenue from that change in the first place?
Yeah, so you're right, the OBR did initially say that higher taxes would lead to fewer jobs, which is completely what you would expect. The question is always how many fewer jobs, obviously, and that's difficult because we can't measure that directly because lots of things in the economy are changing. You have to somehow estimate that. I think it's too early for us to be able to estimate how much has been of any change in employment or unemployment has been the tax versus AI or national minimum wages or something else. So I think we'll have to, in some sense, wait and hope we can look back and work it out a bit. So I don't have an independent assessment of is it how much higher or lower it is than the OBR, but it would have an effect. One number I do have in front of me is that you're absolutely right that a central judgment in the OBR forecast, in their central forecast, is that unemployment is temporary and it comes down again. They do some other scenarios around that. If unemployment settled at, say, 5.5%, and if that was because of the higher labour costs as opposed to something else, then they estimate that borrowing could be around 21 billion higher by the end of the forecast period. So that gives you a sense of scale of, if it wasn't temporary, if there was some structural element related to higher labour costs, that would have a material effect on borrowing that you would have to do something about in some sense. So I think the answer is we don't know yet how much of it has been employment related to tax costs directly, but this stuff matters, and it matters obviously for the people involved directly. It matters unemployment, but it matters for the public finances too.
And would you? I need to move on.
All under her control.
No, that's fine. So you may have also heard commentary about immigration figures as well. They've recently been revised. Do you have any views on what the sort of real activity of immigration is right now, and what impact do you foresee that might have on the public finances? And if I can squeeze in my second question straight away, with the proposed changes to the immigration system in the UK, what do you think the sort of medium and long-term impacts to the public finances would be of those?
Yeah. The short answer is I don't. I think that, my main takeaway is that the UK needs better data on these things. We have a real lack of information about the composition of people who've come to the UK, the composition of people who are leaving, and clearly the composition is going to matter hugely. It really matters whether you have people who are, low skilled and young versus retired. Who's leaving matters a huge amount. So what I would note is that given that the OBR changed, as was discussed earlier, its forecast based on the ONS revisions. I would expect the OBR to be looking at inward migration, not just numbers but types of people, because that obviously affects the forecast. We at IFS are going to do some work over summer trying to get a better pitch from the data available, but I think it's an underlying sort of missing data problem that we don't have great data available. So now you can piece together some things from surveys, some things from administrative data, kind of more creatively perhaps, but I think the fundamental issue is the UK needs better data on who's here, who's coming, who's leaving, so that we can have more informed debates about kind of underlying policy choices, but also about what any policy choice would mean, because obviously it will matter depending on which skills visa you have, and who you constrain is going to have a huge impact on the public finances.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dean. Dame Harriet.
Yeah, leads right into my question, really. It seems extraordinary when there's so much anecdote about, a millionaire leaving the UK every 45 minutes and, a giant exodus of wealthy people, that there doesn't seem to be any data about this mix of net migration and the amount that people are paying. And you're saying that you haven't been able to find any data on that.
Yes, I think there is some data out there from some surveys, and as I was talking about earlier, part of the problem is that surveys haven't been doing wonderfully recently, so there's sort of a lack of trust in surveys. And there's some administrative data, but often, the administrative data is collected for tax purposes, it's not collected for the purpose of monitoring people. So I think in general, not enough is known. And there's a separate issue about, even if we had perfect information about everyone in the country and their characteristics, it still wouldn't, some of the questions about how are people responding to policy aren't things that one can measure. You have to work out, because all things are changing, lots of things are changing at the same time. So I think there's an underlying data problem, but it would still be difficult to know the effects of policies.
If I may just ask Ms. Mehta, because I think your firm manages money for lots of wealthy people, would you say, from the point of view of your business, and obviously I don't want you to give any confidential information or anything that's not public, but have you seen a behavioural response amongst your clientele?
We haven't got that data, haven't got any kind of insights into whether our clients are moving abroad. I would echo what Helen said around the data. I also note that I think HMRC said that it will be in the 2027 self-assessment data when we'll get a much clearer idea of whether people have moved in response to the tax changes over the last, say, year or so. So no, we don't have anything specific on that. But it is worth saying that the I guess the kind of broader uncertainty around tax policy is something that, like all uncertainty, is bound to have some impact and behavioural unintended consequences.
And have you seen any behavioural changes to the non-domiciled tax changes at all?
Again, don't have anything specific on that.
Okay, moving on then to another subject in terms of the Institute for Government's analysis. One of the things that was in the statement last week was that another 1 million people of pensionable age who rely exclusively on the state pension will be brought into paying personal taxation because of the thresholds being frozen. And I just wondered, from an administrative point of view, we've heard in interviews that the Chancellor has said she wants to do something about that. She doesn't want to be taking small amounts of tax off lots of people whose only income is a £12,500 state pension. Have you done any work on this from an Institute for Government point of view?
We haven't done anything specific on the most recent change. I guess it's a general problem with tax threshold freezes as a method for increasing the tax take through those taxes, that you will come across these kind of threshold effects and as you bring people up through the threshold. And therefore it's one of the things that government should be thinking about when they think about...
this will be a particularly vulnerable group of people,
absolutely.
Elderly pensioners.
Absolutely.
On very low incomes. Yeah. Has anyone else heard of anything that is being used as a solution potentially by HMRC?
So I don't know what HMRC are thinking. One thing I'd note is, in some sense, if the only issue was to say, take people who only get the state pension, you could just say we won't tax you and you haven't got to do right to declare it. I think actually that is probably relatively straightforward, although obviously you have to think of a mechanism for that. I think the harder case is going to be what about somebody who has a very small amount of other income, £50 in dividends or something very small? Do you then default them into tax income? Like what's the boundary issue basically? At what point does their full income come in or not? So I think that the interesting, and that's a policy question as much as a policy question. That's a kind of a question about at what point do you want to start taxing somebody, and then the mechanism of how to do it can sort of follow from that. But I think that question about when is the bit of state pension over the threshold going to be taxed, if ever, I think is the kind of policy question.
Okay, we will continue our investigation on that subject.
Thank you very much. And I did say at the beginning, I think before the cameras went on, that we have the Chancellor at the Exchequer in front of us tomorrow morning. So I'm going to ask each of you what you would like to ask her if she was sitting in front of you. So I start with Mr. Haile.
Thanks for that.
Well, I think you're well. You should be well versed in this at the IFG.
So I think we had the spring forecast. We know that central forecast is no longer our central forecast for where we think we're going. I think there's a question for the Chancellor about structuring the short, medium and long-term government policy in terms of thinking about what are the decisions that need to happen now versus where are the areas where you can improve policy design on what happened last time. So there's a question about if this is the similar size of shock to previously, and we've had that discussion a bit already, but there's also a question of how the policy response can be changed and improved. So I think it's at that threshold of kind of what are the short, medium, long-term ways you think through that.
I'm sure that's very much on her mind. But thank you for that. Helen Miller.
So I was trying to think of a question that wasn't entirely obvious in the sense that, partly there's obviously questions about state of public finances and does she still think she's got the right plan after the Middle East? But in some sense, a more specific question would be, that I would genuinely like to know the answer to, is to what extent does she feel like the gaps in data are holding back her decision making actually are the things that she wishes she knew that would make her better able to make policy? And then I would suggest that it's within her power to direct a bit of resource in that direction, whether that's about immigration.
Should make all economists in the room very happy.
No, actually, I think a lot of this is not about economists. I think actually it's about much more fun. It's about people who go. So whether it's about immigration or whether it's about having the data that if you think in the winter you want to be making a big energy support package, I'm not saying they should, but if they did, spending a bit of money now to collect the data that would allow you to target that package, so it could save billions of pounds in the winter. So why not now think about getting some smart people collecting some data? So yeah, I'd have a nerdy data question.
I think we're in the nerdy camp together then. There's a lot of us here around the table. Hetal, Mehta.
I think for me the clear thing is that obviously I agree that there's been far too much focus on one specific fiscal headroom number, but it's really to understand the extent to which tax versus spend versus kind of growth policies. What's the pecking order? Should there be a shock and that fiscal headroom, that buffer is eroded? What is the menu of options? In what order would the Chancellor actually try to tackle it?
And I'm sure she's thinking about that. Dr. Amrita Sen.
I think I'd focus on, in terms of where my remit sits, is how is she thinking through the energy cost and the pass-through mechanism, especially if this goes on. What does it look like for the winter for households? I think that'll be important. And I also do echo what everybody said over here. I work in an industry where I would have said London in particular had a huge number of energy, like oil, gas market participants, whether it's traders, hedge funds, etc. Talking to pretty much all of them, they are in the Middle East somewhere these days, right? So it's happening. The data would be very, very crucial to that, because otherwise, how do you make the measurement about, are we actually net gaining or losing from these tax changes?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I thank our witnesses very much indeed. That's Dan Haile from the Institute of Government, Helen Miller from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, Hetal, Mehta from St James's Place, and Dr. Amrita Sen from the Market Intelligent Energy Aspects. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you as well to our colleagues at Hansard for recording this. Transcript of both sessions will be available on the website uncorrected in the next couple of days, and thanks to our colleagues at Bowtie for the broadcasting. Order, order.